Suspension is a vital component in all automobiles. It typically consists of the wheel, obviously, a spring and shock absorber, and the various rods and bars that hold it all together. The goal of the suspension on any given car is to maintain the firmest possible contact between the wheels and the road surface in order to maximize grip and minimize the bumps and dips that you feel while driving. Basically, if your front left wheel goes over a bump, you don't want your whole car to tip a little bit. You want just that front left wheel to climb right over the bump so that the rest of the car can remain level. A good way to conceptualize suspension is to imagine riding a bike. I hope you all know what riding a bike feels like, because if you don't, you're missing out. But anyways, there are two ways to ride a bike. You can ride sitting down or standing up. Riding standing up is like driving with suspension. When you go over bumps or down a curb, your legs absorb most of that impact. Riding while sitting down would be like driving without suspension. A few of you, especially if you're a guy, have had that time when you're riding a bike and you're just too lazy to lift your butt off the seat when you're going down a curb and had your day just instantly ruined. Now imagine that, but in a car going 60 miles per hour on the freeway. Now you can start to understand why suspension is so important. And it doesn't only add comfort, especially in performance cars. Suspension does a lot to increase traction and stability, but I'll get to all that later. Firstly, to understand how suspension functions, you need to know the basic parts that make it up. While discussing the basic components of a suspension system, I'll be using the pushrod system as an example, because it shares many parts from both basic road car suspension and more complicated racing-oriented suspension systems. Instead of having the spring and shock connected directly to the wheel, pushrod systems have a long rod connecting the two. This rod is called the pushrod. The advantage of this setup is that the designer has a lot more flexibility for where the spring and shock absorber are located. With most road cars, the shock and spring are mounted above the wheel, but with a pushrod system, they can be mounted somewhere else, allowing the body of the car to sit a little bit lower, which is favorable for performance. The uprights are one of the most important parts of the suspension system, and they come in many different shapes and sizes. There's one per wheel, and they act as a central mounting point for most of the components and are what holds everything together. The front and rear uprights are usually slightly different to accommodate things such as a steering link, which is what allows the driver to steer, or the drivetrain, which is what actually turns the wheels when you step on the gas. It's hard to rank the importance of each component when talking about something like suspension, because to an extent, each and every part is necessary for a fully functioning car. However, removing some parts will impair the car more than others. The uprights to a suspension system are kind of like what a torso is to a human being. Going back to the bike analogy, because I'm not very creative, your torso doesn't really do anything while you ride a bike. Your arms and legs are what do all the bike riding. However, your arms and legs wouldn't be able to ride a bike without a torso connecting them. Suspension is the same way. The upright doesn't actually do anything, but it's what holds all the other pieces together. Bicycle analogy aside, a car without uprights would be completely non-functional. The wheels would simply fall off, and all the linkages that hold the wheel in place would have nothing to attach to. They are usually machined out of a single piece of aluminum, titanium, or similar metal. The control arms are the main link between the chassis of the car and the wheels. This specific control arm setup is called a double wishbone because, well, they look like two wishbones. Performance cars typically use a double wishbone setup because it allows the wheels to compress and rebound without allowing for too much camber in either direction. This is important because too much camber can cause a loss of traction and uneven wear on the tires. Control arms are another relatively inexpensive part of the suspension, considering that they're just two beams welded together in a V-shape. However, on high-end open-wheel cars such as Formula 1, the arms have been designed to resemble airplane wings more than just normal cylindrical beams, as to reduce a small amount of air resistance. The change in shape, as well as the use of lighter materials like carbon fiber, drives the price up to magnitudes of what it might have been on a Ford Focus or whatnot. The pushrod, bell crank, shock absorber, and spring are all separate parts, but they collectively all have the same function. Their function is to transfer the vertical motion from the wheels to the shock absorber where it can be absorbed. Whenever the wheel goes over a bump, the pushrod is forced upwards, which then pushes the bell crank. The bell crank then rotates clockwise and compresses the shock. That entire action is called compression. Likewise, whenever the car goes over a dip, the wheel is no longer supported and starts to move downwards. The wheel pulls the pushrod, which then pulls the bell crank. The bell crank rotates counterclockwise and expands the shock. The bell crank is the cheapest and most simple of the three parts. Usually, it is machined out of a single piece of metal, however some designs use just two triangular pieces of metal instead. The shape and size vary a lot between cars, but always resemble a triangle in some way or another, with the connections between the chassis, pushrod, and shock absorber making up the 3 points. The pushrod is very similar to the control arms in the way that it can be designed. A basic pushrod can just be a single cylindrical beam, however more expensive performance-oriented pushrods are shaped more similarly like airplane wings to reduce drag. The shock absorber and spring are the most complex and expensive part. They can range anywhere from $20,000 to $20,000 for just a single one. If you're driving your Honda Civic to work, it probably doesn't matter too much that your shocks keep your car perfectly level. However, if you're driving a Formula 1 car 120 miles per hour around a tight corner, it is very important that your car stays perfectly level. Race cars are designed to provide the maximum amount of downforce and traction when they're level. This means that if the car tips too far in either direction, it will lose traction, which can have fatal consequences at such high speeds. The most common type of suspension for road cars is the McPherson strut. It consists of one control arm connected to the bottom of the upright and a spring vertically connected to the chassis. Compared to other types of suspension, the McPherson strut is relatively simple. It's cheap, and due to the fact that it only uses one control arm, it's also more compact than other types of suspension, which means that there's a lot more room for the trunk or engine. However, it comes with its fair share of disadvantages as well. Due to the way that the strut is mounted vertically near the top of the upright, the body of the car often sits slightly higher than other types of suspension. This isn't a big deal for most road cars, but when it comes to race cars, it can be detrimental. Like stated before, the lower the center of gravity of a car, the more stable it is. In addition, the lower a car is, the less likely it is to accidentally generate lift. If you've ever seen a race car suddenly lift off the ground and flip into the air while racing, that's why. It typically happens when the car is going over a small hill and the front bumper lifts high enough off the ground that air is able to make it underneath and cause the entire car to act as an aerofoil, which is just a fancy term for an airplane wing. Obviously, this is extremely dangerous, and even if the car doesn't entirely lift off the ground, it can cause attempts to steer the car to be unavailing. Another major disadvantage of the McPherson strut is that the angle of camber changes as the suspension compresses or rebounds. Once again, when it comes to road cars, this is mostly negligible. However, like mentioned previously, too much camber in either direction can cause a loss of traction. Another type of suspension that is commonly used on road cars is the leaf spring design. A leaf spring consists of several curved pieces of metal that are sandwiched together. The axle then rests directly on top of these pieces. Due to the conical design of leaf springs, they are able to withstand large amounts of vertical force. This is because the force is distributed along the lengths of the spring and isn't concentrated in one place like with other suspension setups. Thanks to this load-bearing capability, leaf springs are mostly used in trucks and other transport vehicles. However, as you might expect, they have their fair share of disadvantages as well. Once again, due to their inherent design, leaf springs aren't easy to tune. The spring force is based entirely on what metal the spring is made out of and how many layers of metal there are in it. The only real way to tune a leaf spring would be to replace it entirely with one that better fits your needs. Because of this, leaf springs aren't often used on performance cars. Similar to the McPherson strut, leaf springs' simplicity makes them cheap and easy to produce.